A faltering economic recovery and setbacks in globalization. Can the BRICS still serve as the voice of emerging markets and an engine of global growth? The BRICS countries are already about the same economic size as the G7, but can they ever rival the G7 in terms of global influence? Months-long standoff between China and India in the border area. Will divergence like this overshadow the agenda of the BRICS member states? China proposed the concept of expansion in BRICS Plus. Will the paradigm inject fresh momentum in the next chapter of the BRICS?
Despite India-China tension over the Doklam standoff, Beijing is still upbeat about the BRICS summit in the Chinese city of Xiamen, expecting concrete cooperation among the 5 emerging markets. While BRICS' role in global governance, a faltering economic recovery and setbacks in globalization will be addressed on the occasion. What are the potentials to be discussed on this occasion? And will BRICS Plus provide opportunities for other economies and inject impetus into the world? Today, I'm honored to be joined here in the Beijing studio by Hua Liming, former Chinese ambassador to Iran, the Netherlands, Andrei Denisov, Russian ambassador to China, and Marcos Caramuro da Paiva, Brazilian ambassador to China. We shall also talk to Dalana Mismon, South Africa's ambassador to China, and also Subramanyam Swami, member of Indian Parliament in this upper house via satellite. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to our Dialogue Special, Mr. Ambassadors. 10 years on, after BRICS was first launched into mechanism, the world economic landscape has undergone great changes, and therefore there is a growing voice calling for the enlargement or recruitment of other major economies. Here is the issue of representation. What do you think of the public concern on prospects of BRICS and the very issue of representation?
Thank you very much for your question, and good day. My perception is that BRICS is a young institution. We are not mature enough to make that step. I just want to draw your attention to the fact that within BRICS there is very effective and traditional framework for dialogue with other countries, that is outreach. And every time many countries, leaders of these countries are being invited to participate in the discussions with BRICS leaders. And I think it works. And it would be in Xiamen this year as well. So that's why we expect very colorful and multifaceted dialogue between BRICS countries' leaders and guests, distinguished guests from different parts of the world.
We appreciate your articulation about such a rosy picture concerning prospects of BRICS. But Marcos, what do you think of the representation of BRICS as the voice of emerging markets in China, in the world?
Well, first of all, I want to say that the last 10 years were bumpy years for the international economy. The initial reaction was to make countries recover growth. But some of the impact of the crisis are only now felt in a number of countries, in a number of mature economies. And I think that during these 10 years, the BRICS went very far. We've done a number of things. We created a new development bank. We were able to improve our levels of cooperation in many different areas. But as it was said before, it's a long-term proposition. And in this long-term proposition, we have to mature ourselves in the discussion of a number of topics, but while maturing, invite the other countries to participate in our efforts. And that's what we have been doing. At every meeting of the BRICS, we invite a number of countries. China is doing for the first time the idea, that is implementing the idea of inviting not only countries from the region of the country that chairs the meeting, that should be Asia, but inviting countries from different regions in the world. This is already a new step.
What do you think of the message that China delivers through inviting countries in our neighborhood to join the BRICS summit? Do you think this predicts a strong sign, or it indicates a strong beginning of a process of enlargement?
The 5 countries of BRICS are all a symbol of emerging economies or developing countries. So I never think BRICS is limited to only the 5 countries. They are the representatives of emerging economies and developing countries. So I think it's natural that India initiated the model of BRICS Plus, and China continued to do that. So I think this will be a model of South-South cooperation. Will never be just limited to the 5 countries. We remember when it was established 10 years before, it was 4 countries, and South Africa added or joined just 7 years before. So I think that whether enlarged or not, BRICS will be a representative of all developing or emerging economies.
Up next, let me talk to the ambassador from South Africa, the elegant lady, Dolana Mismang. First of all, my question is, while Africa's growth was listed as a key subject at this year's G20 summit in Hamburg, what's South Africa's agenda at the BRICS summit in promoting African voices?
As you know, South Africa is the only African country in BRICS, and therefore that automatically makes South Africa to represent itself as well as the voice of the continent. And as you also very well know, that our continent is probably the poorest of all the continents in the world. And therefore there is a major responsibility to ensure that BRICS assist the continent in reducing or eliminating completely the poverty within the continent. And therefore South Africa's contribution to this is that its voice is mainly the voice of Africa itself. But as you well know, the BRICS has established a bank, the New Development Bank, which was established in Shanghai, and the African Regional Center, which is a part of that bank, is based in South Africa. We just opened last week, I think on the 16th of August, where there was the inauguration of that African Regional Center. The African Regional Center will go a long way in contributing towards Africa's development, particularly infrastructure development.
BRICS countries are already about the same economic size as the G7, but can BRICS rival the G7 in terms of global influence?
I think BRICS already has its own influence. You don't need to compare it to the G7 because the purposes are different. The purpose of BRICS was to first be the voice of the developing communities and emerging communities, and it's doing that very well. And also BRICS was there to become an alternative where the same communities find a problem, particularly in securing finance for the development of their countries or regions. And therefore BRICS has a different agenda altogether from the G7. And I think for its own agenda, BRICS is doing very well, making good progress and moving in the right direction. The bank was a very major step in the achievement of this goal. But also BRICS has also represented the developing communities in all the world for us, and therefore giving more strength even to the sustainable goals, development goals, which will benefit mostly the developing world.
Thank you, Ambassador Dolana Mismang, for being with us. Thank you so much for your answers. What can be done to further promote the authority and representation of BRICS so that it will be viewed as a formidable force to reckon with, so that it it can really become the most dynamic market for developed nations?
Well, I think, first of all, to increase our capacity to put our houses in order. I mean, to keep sound policies at home. The second thing is to encourage entrepreneurs and investors to invest in one another's economy. This is an essential point. And the third thing is to look for innovative ways of cooperation in many different areas. I think, coming back to the previous question, that the competitive advantages are basically two. One, the complementarity between some of our economies. Two, the potential to grow. The potential to grow is an essential element in this group.
Thank you so much. Let me go to Mr. Swami, Member of Parliament in India, for his comments on what should be done to promote the authority and representation of BRICS as a very influential bloc among all other platforms. Hello, Mr. Swami. Now, China is accused by Indians of trying to invite its own allies to dilute the role that India could play. Now, for the Chinese, this sounds more like a conspiracy theory, and we don't take it very seriously. I'd like to take your advice about how we should view the future of BRICS properly.
Well, I think, first of all, I don't know whether I've heard anybody officially say this, that this is a conspiracy or the Indian authorities being diluted. But I do know that we do have differences just now, and there's been a lot of verbal exchange at the media level. I think BRICS should expand, but it should not lead to intra-country conflict, and therefore perhaps if the choice of countries is done by unanimity, that all 5 countries agreeing, then additional membership would not pose a problem. The problem really would arise if it's not unanimous and some country comes in by majority vote. I think that would create problems.
You know, there's a popular saying here in the Chinese media, dialogue is always far better than confrontation between the United States and China. I think this should also be applied to the fragile relationship at this moment between our 2 major economies. Having said this, what do you think of the impact of having a very good, constructive relationship between New Delhi and Beijing for the rest of the world? I mean, we are the most populous and the most dynamic economy, and of course yours is fast catching up. What do you think of an elephant and a dragon joining hand to deliver a real and huge impact? What does that mean for you, from your perspective?
Well, you know, I've been always an advocate of very strong relations between India and China. In fact, right in 1978, when I was a very young member of parliament, the Prime Minister chose me, then Prime Minister Mr. Desai chose me to go to make the first trip to China after, official trip after 1962. And and since then I've always been advocating that the 2 principal countries which can make a big difference to global security is if India and China come together, and we need to work out our differences by negotiations. So I think let's remember that when India and China got together in Stockholm on the environment conference, the Americans had to back down. I mean, that's the power of the 2 of us coming together, and we need to do that more often.
Thank you so much, Mr. Swami, the Member of Parliament from India. Welcome back. Ambassador Denisov, whether China is able to exert a great influence worldwide largely depends on our ability to build consensus, and also the fact that India has been recruited by the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as a new member, along with Pakistan. Russia is very strongly supportive of this idea of having India, your traditional friend, and join this regional bloc. What kind of a position does Moscow hold for bringing India and China together? Do you prefer to have a dialogue, or you prefer to sit back as an onlooker?
No, I would like to say, just to point out, that both China and India are strategic partners for my country, are very close friends, and our cooperation with both China and India is developing in a very good shape. That's the first point. My second point is that, of course, we not just hope, but we have no doubt that wisdom prevails and should prevail, and all these attritions between two biggest countries in the world, I mean India and China, would be overpassed due to the wisdom of Chinese and Indian people, nations, governments, leaders, and everything. Finally, the settlement for outstanding troubles would be found out. If Russia, as a good friend for both, can be helpful, then why not? But I think that India and China can settle just on a bilateral framework. You have pointed out that India and China are not only member states within BRICS group, but Shanghai Cooperation Organization as well. I can add so-called RIC framework, that is a mechanism for ministerial meetings by ministers of foreign affairs of China, India and Russia. It also works effectively. Ministers meet on a regular basis to discuss outstanding issues of mutual concern. I think all these frameworks would be helpful in order to mitigate any attrition, not just for a time being, but in the long run as well.
Not all of the economies within the BRICS framework are very dynamic. For example, Russian economy is struggling given the pretty low oil price and the economic sanctions imposed by the United States and the European Union following Crimea. So what do you think of the competitive edge of your economy, and so that Russia may survive this recent round of enlargement, quote unquote?
No doubt can survive. I think there is not such a question is not appropriate. Russia is a full-fledged member of our five nations, five economies institution, and we have our own advantages and our own things to be presented to our partners, to our colleagues within BRICS framework. As far as dynamics, economic growth is concerned, I would like to say that this year the economic performance in my country is better than it was before. There is not so big but substantial economic growth, and we are encouraged by it. And it reflects in our international exchange. For example, Russia's trade turnover with China, quarter to quarter, is growing on about 30 to 40% this year. So there is no ground for skepticism. I think that our cooperation within BRICS can help Russia to not just to survive, there's not such a question, but to overcome the outstanding troubles and develop cooperation with, as you have fairly pointed out, two most dynamic economies in the world. I mean China and India. And Brazil as well, which is our traditional partner, and South Africa now.
Following the great success of the Olympic Games that was hosted by a country that is full of soccer superstars. The question is, what negative impact might be brought about by the political upheavals and chaos in your country? Because not only the previous president has been impeached, but the current president is also put under investigation for the alleged corruption scandal. Do you think politics will wreak havoc with the economic recovery of your country?
Well, first of all, I don't think that the situation in Brazil is a chaotic situation. On the contrary, we have the institutions working very well, we have the force of law working very well, and everybody who follows the Brazilian political reality sees that yes, we are having difficulties, but the difficulties are being solved through the force of law, through legal procedures, to institutions playing their own role. And this is a good sign in the long run. This means that despite the difficulties that we may have, the institutions are going to prevail and show their own force. The second point is that we have not seen the economy suffering the impact of the political reality in Brazil. On the contrary, investments have been flowing quite strongly to Brazil, both portfolio investments and FDI and long-term investments. One of the reasons for that is that despite the political situation, the government has been able to approve important reforms in our reality.
For example, what kind of reforms? Labor reform?
The labor reform was just approved. It's quite a strong reform. It has a big impact on the life of the average worker.
But I'm afraid you're going to have very strong opposition from the parliament and the solidarity union, so to speak.
Well, we have to build consensus. It's not an easy proposition in Brazil because we have too many parties in our political reality. Building consensus needs a lot of effort in terms of talking to the different parties, making the necessary arrangements and the necessary negotiations, and every reform that has to do with the life of the average citizen is a difficult reform. Then the
efficiency and effectiveness of policy execution will be seriously compromised as a result of the democratic virtues, right?
Well, you have to accept the fact that in democracy, sometimes the timing is not the timing that you expect. But the point is, the important thing is first to give a sense of direction in the long run. The second thing is to raise confidence on the part of the investors. Brazil is an economy that has very low savings rates, 16% of GDP, compared with China, for example.
Or even Germany, where we have a high savings.
Oh, China, 46% of GDP. Brazil, 16% of GDP. So we have always counted on international financing and on international investments to grow. And what we have seen is that despite the political reality, this confidence still exists. The capital is flowing, investments are coming.
Ambassador Marcos, one representative from IISS, which sponsors the Shangri-La Security Dialogue for the Asia-Pacific region, asked me if this vision, the Belt and Road Initiative, smacks of a geopolitical rivalry between China and other competitors, because they are skeptical about what China really wants. They say, hey, this is a communist regime, therefore we don't trust this very different political system. And therefore, they would always use the ideological lens to examine whatever China says or whatever we do, either in the South China Sea or when we present the idea of a Belt and Road Initiative. They would always use a lens to examine the issue of transparency or strategic intent. I'd like to have your voice from Latin America. Now, maybe in Chinese words, distance generates beauty. From a remote country like Brazil, how do you look at the role China plays in rebuilding or improving the world economic order in the wake of the devastating financial crisis in 2008?
Well, I think that we have to accept the fact that the international order, the economic order mainly, has been changing, and that China has become a big player. The second largest economy in the world, the first trade partner of a number of countries, a country that exports around $150 billion in investments every year. This has an impact on the international economy. And this impact rearranges the reality in a certain way. And I think so far, from a purely economic point of view, this rearrangement has been going very well and has had a positive impact in Latin America, for example. You asked me to answer as a Latin American, because we have seen more trade, more investments in Latin America. The second thing is that I think the whole idea of a presence in international life and it was very well expressed in the One Belt and Road Initiative, is the fact that China has a pragmatic approach towards cooperation. So we are not discussing rules, we are not discussing commitments, we are discussing basically how can we contribute to international growth. And the Chinese idea is that if we invest in infrastructure, this always has an impact on growth because it generates investments, generates trade and all that. And I think that this is unquestionable. There's no political thinking or hidden political thinking behind that. And it is going to impose by itself. And I don't see any clear objection to that. On the contrary, we saw how many countries representative in the One Belt and Road meeting here in Beijing. Most of the big economies were here, some with ministers, some with people who are not ministers, but representatives of a high ranking. So I think that, well, yes, there will be a change in the international reality. There will be a change in governance, perhaps. There will be a change in thinking on a number of aspects. China has a big role to play. The big issue is to make this transition to this new reality a transition that is peaceful, that makes sense, and that is beneficial to all countries.
If you remember, Foreign Minister Wang Yi said in last March in his press conference that China hopes partnership rather than alliance. So China never seek any kind of alliance, even the One Belt and One Road. China would initiate many things to the world to promote the globalization, to promote the win-win relationship between international relationship. I don't think China is going to lead the world economy or lead the world politics. I think these are two things different.
So inclusiveness might be the key word in describing the Belt and Road Initiative. However, in the wake of the Cold War ambassadors, newcomers in the United States would stand for liberal democracy, hence we saw Arab Spring, color revolutions in some of the countries. Some countries were able to survive the shock therapy and even the revolution, the street protests. Others failed to survive the shocks. For example, Ukraine, they had presidential elections, but the corruption was rampant. So what do you think of the issue of diversification in bringing about the vibrancy of globalization, for example?
Well,
it might be difficult for a democracy like Brazil to negate virtues or strong virtues of democracy. But democracy, is it the only universal appeal?
No, that's the point. I think if we look at history, we have to accept the fact that societies and economies that matured throughout the last 30, 40 years or even more were economies that were practicing liberal capitalism associated with open democracy, or open capitalism and liberal democracy. But this does not mean at all, in my view, that this is the only model available. It's absolutely possible to create or to design new forms of public management that are not necessarily these ones, and may have a strong effect in terms of improving the quality, the standards of living of the population. After all, that's the role of any policy, of any sound policy, to improve the quality of living of the population. To the extent that policies are able to do this, and China is a very good example, then, they have a merit and they have a big role to play. The world will learn to live with different trends in terms of different political approaches, different economic approaches, and will have to coordinate positions all the time. This means that the need for international coordination at the economic and the political level are going to be stronger. But that's what we have to build in the future. That's the role of diplomats, after all. And to a large extent, that's what the BRICS as a group have been trying to do.
The BRICS countries are already about the same economic size of G7, but does it mean that we are going to rival the influence of G7 in the wake of the financial crisis back in the year 2008, when G20 was able to be used as a major platform for developing countries, major emerging markets, along with the industrial nations to address the issue of common concern, like how to improve the flawed international financial order. Very quickly, starting from Ambassador Hua Liming.
G7 groups was a symbol of industrialized countries. Actually, they have ruled the world for 500 years. But recently, for the recent decades, they have many setbacks. So I believe the BRICS will have many challenges and even still will have some setbacks. But as I said in the beginning, BRICS is the hope of the future, the world. BRICS is the representative of emerging economies of the world.
Ambassador Marcos.
Well, I don't think we can speak of competition between the G7 and the BRICS. Today we have the G20, we have the G7, and we have the BRICS. And the BRICS are not only involved into policy formulation or policy recommendations or policy positioning. It has a lot to do with sharing experiences. The fact that we are economies that are not fully mature means that we have a number of challenges and a number of problems that are common to all of us. And this aspect of sharing experiences that the BRICS have been using extensively by discussing policies in all different sectors is a very important aspect of our interconnection. Besides that, I think that, to a large extent, the order that existed before is being challenged by some countries, or some new ideas are coming, or some commitments are being reversed. And we, the BRICS countries, by reaffirming some of these commitments, will have a bigger contribution to the international coexistence.
Ambassador Denisov, yes, indeed, we have constructed the BRICS Development Bank. But unlike the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, for example, this region, this bloc, BRICS, doesn't have its own secretariat for the execution of some of the policy options or proposals that might be raised at this BRICS summit in Xiamen. Or previously, we have put forward many other interesting proposals. However, implementation of such proposals might become an issue that will be increasingly featured by the media.
The absence of institutions, of some, mechanisms, is on one hand advantage. On the other hand, it's a shortcoming. It's a matter of, dialectic approach, what we really need. For the time being, as far as I understand, BRICS group is kind of a forum for discussions, for coming to some mutually accepted views, conclusions, and decision for putting forward some indicators, some guidelines, how to move forward for all of us, bearing in mind our own interests and our common interests. I don't think that we really need mechanism right now. Who knows? It can change in some long run, but for the time being, for example, there are two opposite options. One is consensus, and thus we have to work in order to achieve that consensus. And the second is discipline, when majority takes a decision and others have to obey. What we have in BRICS is, lack of executive discipline, but strong will to achieve mutual understanding and the results and decision accepted for everybody. And I think for the time being, it's better fits the needs of BRICS member states than any kind of, mechanical approach.
Ambassador Hua Liming, let's look at the cultural exchange, people-to-people exchange to promote soft power of BRICS. most young Chinese are more impressed, perhaps, by Bollywood. It's the Asian equivalent of Hollywood, and we were so impressed by a story that conveys a message about feminism and how a successful father could help his two daughters become champion in the wrestling match of the British Commonwealth. So that's a very big success story that could be very inspiring for many more young Chinese who want to be successful. What do you think of the merits of having more people-to-people exchange in the cultural industry?
That's very important part of the relationship between the BRICS countries. Personally, I appreciate the diversity of the five members of the BRICS. Russia from Europe, Brazil from Latin America, China, India from Asia, two parts of Asia, different cultures and different social systems and different ideas. So we need to exchange, to understand each other. And this is a cross-continent exchange. I think this can be a very good example for all of the developing countries in the world, that we have different religious beliefs, we may have different political systems, even ideologies, but we can exchange, we can understand and make peace in the world. If the five countries from the different continents can exchange through cultural exchanges, even sport exchanges, I think that this will be very helpful for the BRICS consolidation of the BRICS relationship.
Yeah, of course, millions of Chinese football fans would be driven mad by the idea of inviting some of the Brazilian soccer superstars to join us and show up the competitive edge of Chinese football performance, which is so alarmingly poor at this moment. The cultural exchanges.
It's very expensive.
We can flex our financial muscles to hire, not to buy, some of the most expensive Brazilian football stars. But in what way can China and Brazil enhance our cultural exchange?
Well, there are many things we can do, and I think the BRICS may help a lot. I was present at the BRICS Film Festival this year, for example, and there was a film that was made of different short films by different directors from all of the BRICS countries, and that was a fascinating experience. But there are a number of things that we can work together. One thing is that, and hopefully very soon we are going to conclude an agreement between the Brazilian Federation of Soccer and the Chinese Federation of Soccer. The second thing that we are working on is on an agreement that has to do with filmmaking. You see, production, Brazilians and Chinese doing things together. The third thing is a lot of cooperation at universities and at the university level. And I think one of the most important achievements of the BRICS was this network of universities that this will put young people together. And now we are extending this to middle-level schools, to middle schools, you know, to organize summer camps and all that. So there are a number of things that we can do. The other things is that we are enlarging the period for visas. You know, we are going to grant 5 years visas to Chinese coming to Brazil, and Brazilians coming to China. All that has a people-to-people impact, and all that is going to help to show that we are much more than soccer and samba, despite the fact that on soccer and some music in general, Brazil is really very good.
We know President Putin is known for judo. And a few years ago, he even visited the Shaolin Temple in Henan province. Yeah. That was very impressive. What message would he convey to the Chinese audiences and netizens when he comes to attend the BRICS summit in Xiamen?
I just want to say that my president is not just a politician and political leader. He is just a human person with his own vision of, how to say, of life habits and maybe ways of life. He is a sportsman, as you have pointed out, and he is a strong advertiser of a healthy way of life. That is the first. And the second, he is well known for protection of wildlife, of Siberian tigers and other...
You know, Siberian tigers used to be called the Dongbeihu. From Dongbei,
from northeast China,
right?
Because, yes, Siberian tigers can cross the border without any permission. And
without visa, right?
Without visa, yes. Visa-free regime. They enjoy it. And it's our common responsibility to protect these creatures and to help them to increase the number.
Thank you so much for being with us. With that, we come to the end of this special program about the BRICS, which is to take place in Xiamen. BRICS may present a broad spectrum, increasingly diversified by culture differences as well as different levels of economic development. It will also add to the vibrancy of the world economy and perhaps even silver lining for further reforming the problematic world economic order. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.